The bus was carrying Billy farther and farther from everything he had ever known, and somewhere in the pit of his stomach a quiet dread had already taken root. The camp bus bounced and rattled over a narrow winding road, cutting through a landscape that felt like the edge of the world. Red hills sloped in the distance beneath a blazing yellow sky. Stumpy white trees lined the road like forgotten fence posts. No houses, no farms, just desert and silence and the dull ache of homesickness creeping in before the adventure had even begun. Billy sat in the back row on the aisle, where he could count all 22 kids on the bus, 18 boys, 4 girls. The boys were loud and restless, cracking jokes and shouting dumb things, bouncing off the hard blue plastic seats every time the bus hit a bump. The girls sat up front, talking quietly among themselves and glancing back every so often to check out the chaos behind them. Next to Billy sat Mike, a chubby, round-faced boy with short, spiky black hair and baggy brown shorts. Mike looked a little like a bulldog, and he acted like one too, quiet and guarded, pressing his face to the window glass and staring out at the rolling red hills. He told Billy this was his first time at sleepaway camp. It was Billy's first time too. Billy thought about his parents back at the bus station, how serious they had seemed. His dad had promised to write every day. His mum had hugged him harder than usual and said, "Do your best." Not have a good time, do your best. Billy turned that phrase over in his mind, unsure what to make of it. He was a warrior by nature, and little things like that had a way of burrowing in deep. In the seat just ahead of them sat Colin and Jay, 2 boys who could not have been more different. Colin had long brown hair and wore silver sunglasses, and a red bandana on his forehead that he kept tying and untying. He acted tough and quiet. Jay, on the other hand, was the loudest thing on the bus. He had wild, bushy red hair that looked like it had never met a comb, big blue eyes, and a grin that never quit. He spent most of the trip showing off his muscular arms, telling gross jokes, and shouting across the bus at anyone who would listen. He wrestled with Colin constantly, locking the poor kid's head under his arm and messing up the bandana. Jay turned his attention to the girls and called out to a blonde-haired girl sitting by the front window. He asked her name 4 times before she finally turned around, green eyes flashing. She said her name was Dawn, and pointed to the red-haired girl beside her, whose name was Dory. Jay declared with a grin that his name was Dawn too. A lot of the boys laughed. Dawn did not crack a smile. She turned back to the front with the cool dignity of someone who had already decided Jay was not worth her time. Mike broke his long silence to point out a prairie cat he thought he spotted behind a clump of red rocks. Billy leaned over to look but could not see anything except jagged stone and scraggly white trees. Mike frowned and asked if the camp was near a town. Billy told him no, that his dad had said Camp Night Moon was past the desert, way out in the woods. Mike thought about that for a while, his expression troubled, and then asked what they would do if they needed to call home. Billy told him the camp probably had phones. He said it with more confidence than he felt. Farther up the bus, 2 boys were singing a song everyone knew, but with gloriously gross new words. Others were starting to join in. Jay hurled a sticky green ball at Dawn, which hit her right in the back of the head and tangled in her blonde hair. She yanked it free with fury in her eyes and threw it back. It missed Jay and hit the rear window with a loud wet plop. Everyone laughed. Dawn and Dory made faces. Jay slumped in his seat, grinning. Then, without any warning at all, the bus screamed to a stop. Tires skidded. Kids cried out. Billy was launched off his seat and crashed hard into the seat in front of him. His chest ached and his heart was hammering as he slid back down. The whole bus went very still. The driver stood up. He turned around, and the bus filled with gasps. The driver's head was enormous and pink, crowned with a wild mop of bright blue hair that stood straight up in the air. His ears came to long, sharp points. His huge red eyeballs bulged grotesquely from dark sunken sockets, bouncing in front of a snout. like nose. White fangs drooped from a gaping mouth, and a thick green liquid oozed over his heavy black lips. He tilted that monstrous head back and let out a roar that swallowed every other sound in the world. And now the question hung over every frozen, wide-eyed child on that bus. Was this a joke? Was this real? And what exactly had they all agreed to ride toward? The bus windows rattled with a sound that stopped every heart on board. A roar, monstrous and deafening, tore through the vehicle, and kids shrieked in genuine terror. Billy and his new friend Mike dove behind the seat in front of them, crouching low, hearts hammering. Mike whispered that the driver had turned into a monster, his eyes blown wide with fear. Then came the laughter. Billy raised his head just in time to see the driver reach up to his shock of bright blue hair, give it a tug, and peel his entire face clean off. Several kids screamed in horror before the truth dawned on them. The dangling, grotesque thing in the driver's hand was nothing but a rubber mask. His real face was perfectly ordinary, pale and thin-haired, with tiny blue eyes creased with amusement. He shook his head and held the ugly mask high, declaring that it fooled them every single time. A few kids managed to laugh along. Most were too rattled to find it funny at all. But the joke was already over. The driver's grin vanished, replaced by something gruff and businesslike. He ordered everyone off the bus, pulled a lever, and the door whooshed open. Before anyone could process what was happening, someone called out asking where they were, but the driver did not even glance back. He tossed the mask onto his seat, ducked his head to avoid the roof, and stepped outside. Billy pressed across Mike to look out the window and saw almost nothing reassuring. Flat yellow ground stretched in every direction, broken here and there by clumps of red rock. It looked like a desert, empty and indifferent. Mike turned to him with worry already carved into his face, asking why they were getting out in a place like this. Billy made a weak joke about it being the camp. Mike did not laugh. They were the last two off the bus. Having been seated at the back, Billy stepped onto the hard, sun-baked ground and shielded his eyes against the fierce afternoon light. The bus was parked beside a concrete platform, roughly the size of a tennis court, sitting in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Billy told Mike it must be some kind of drop-off point, a bus station of sorts. Mike shoved his hands into his pockets and kicked at the dirt without a word. Around them, the other kids spread out across the platform. Jay was horsing around with a boy Billy had not yet met. Colin leaned against the side of the bus, performing his version of cool. The four girls huddled near the front of the platform, talking quietly among themselves. The driver moved to the luggage compartment, pulled it open, and began hauling out bags and camp trunks one by one, carrying them to the concrete platform without explanation. Mike drifted up behind the sweating driver and asked, nervously but clearly, where they were and why they had stopped. The driver slid a heavy black trunk free and kept moving as though Mike had not made a single sound. Mike asked again and again. The driver gave him nothing, not even a glance. Mike walked back to Billy slowly, dragging his shoes across the dirt, the worry in his face now shading into something closer to fear. Billy felt the worry trying to creep into him too, but he pushed it back. The driver was calm. He was methodical. He clearly knew what he was doing. Still, Mike's questions were getting under Billy's skin, so he wandered away, moving toward the four girls gathered near the edge of the platform. One of them, blonde and bright in the afternoon sun, smiled at him as he approached. Her name was Dawn, and Billy found himself thinking she was really pretty. Her friend Dory, freckled and squinting against the glare, asked if he was from Center City. Billy said no, that he was from Midlands, north of Center City, near Outreach Bay. Dory cut him off and said sharply that she knew where Midlands was. The girls laughed. Billy felt the heat rise in his face. Dawn rescued him gently, asking his name. He told her it was Billy. She lit up and said that was her bird's name, and the girls laughed again. Billy pushed past the embarrassment and asked where they were headed. Dory told him they were all on the same bus, one meant for Camp Night Moon, which had a boys' camp and a girls' camp. None of them had been before. This was the first year for all of them. Before anyone could say much more, Mike was hovering behind Billy again, his voice tight with alarm. The driver had finished unloading. Every bag and trunk was piled on the platform, and the luggage compartment door slammed shut. Mike demanded to know what was happening, whether someone was coming to pick them up, why the driver had unloaded everything. Billy jogged over to ask. The driver saw him coming and moved immediately, climbing back into the bus and sliding into the seat. By the time Billy reached the door, the driver had already pulled his green sun visor down. Billy called in asking if someone was coming for them. The answer was the lever being thrown and the door slamming shut directly in his face. The engine roared. Grey exhaust billowed out. Billy pounded on the glass and screamed, and had to leap back as the tires spun and squealed against the hard dirt. He shouted after the bus as it bounced onto the road and disappeared over the horizon, leaving nothing behind but a settling cloud of dust and a group of stunned, stranded kids. Billy turned back. Mike was standing with the 4 girls now. They were all staring down the road after the bus, faces pale, voices gone quiet. The reality settled over them slowly and heavily. They were in the middle of nowhere, their bags piled on a concrete platform, and the man who had brought them there had driven away without a word. Then, cutting through the silence like something alive, they heard the animal cries, close, very close, and getting closer by the second. What happened next would have shaken the courage of even the bravest soul. One moment the group of kids stood on that lonely concrete platform in the middle of nowhere, bickering and tossing stones. The next, something out of a nightmare was closing in on them fast. It started with a sound, shrill, urgent cries cutting through the open air, coming from somewhere across the platform. For one desperate second, the narrator thought it was Jay and Colin pulling a prank, doing animal impressions to frighten everyone. But one look at Jay and Colin's faces killed that hope cold. They had frozen solid, wide-eyed and pale, and the cries were getting louder. Then she saw them, small dark creatures, keeping low to the ground, rolling forward with terrifying speed, tossing their heads back and shrieking as they came. Dozens of them, surging across the flat earth, as if carried by some invisible wind. The kids scrambled onto the platform and pressed together behind their trunks and bags. Dory's voice trembled as she asked if they were prairie wolves. Mike screamed for help. Jay clutched 2 of the red pebbles he had been throwing earlier and shouted for everyone to pick up rocks, hoping to scare the things away. The creatures stopped just a few yards from the platform and rose up on their hind legs. Standing upright, they were nearly 3 feet tall. Their slender, almost scrawny bodies were patched with spotty red-brown fur. Long silvery claws curved from their paws. Their heads were narrow, nearly as thin as their bodies, and tiny red weasel eyes stared out with a raw, hungry focus. Their long mouths snapped open and shut, flashing double rows of silvery, dagger-like teeth. Mike dropped to his knees, his whole body shaking with terror. Some of the kids wept openly, others simply stared, struck dumb by what they were seeing. The narrator herself could not cry out, could not move. She stood there with her heart hammering and her mouth gone dry as dust. Then the creatures fell quiet. They studied the children from just a few feet away, snapping their jaws with a sound like steel traps being sprung. White froth began to drip from their mouths, pouring thickly over those pointed teeth. One of the boys shouted that they were going to attack. One of the girls said they looked hungry, and then it happened. One creature leaped up onto the edge of the platform. Several kids cried out at once. Another creature climbed up. Then 3 more followed. Jay pulled back his arm and hurled a red rock at one of the frothing animals. It cracked against the platform and bounced away harmlessly. The creatures were not frightened. They arched their backs and began a high-pitched chattering that filled the air and grew deafening, a wall of sound pressing in from every direction. Jay threw again, and this time the rock struck one of them in the side. It let out a shrill cry of surprise, but kept right on moving. Red eyes locked on Jay, jaws snapping. Dory pleaded with them to go away, go home, her voice breaking on every word. It made no difference. The creatures lowered themselves, coiling to pounce. The narrator urged everyone to run. Someone shouted back that they could not outrun them. Her legs felt rubbery and weak, barely her own. Stumbling backward to get away, she tumbled off the edge of the platform and hit the hard ground. Stars burst across her vision as the back of her head struck. Lying there, dazed and helpless, the terrible truth landed on her all at once. The creatures were coming, and she had no way to escape. The chaos erupted without warning, the siren-like attack cries, the scrape of long claws over concrete, the screams of terrified campers. And then, just as things looked their worst, the deafening roar of a rifle split the air. White smoke curled upward as the scraggly creatures spun on their heels and fled, tails tucked between their legs, low to the ground and silent. Now, every bit of their menace gone in an instant. A big, red-faced man stood with the rifle, still poised on his shoulder, watching them go with obvious satisfaction. "Ha ha, look at them run," he boomed. He had come out of the campus, a long green vehicle. Nobody had noticed, pulling up in all the screaming confusion. He was mostly bald, with a fringe of curly yellow hair, a blonde moustache beneath an enormous nose, and tiny black eyes buried under thick blonde brows. When he finally lowered the rifle and turned to face the shaken group of campers, he was grinning. "Hi, guys," he said cheerfully. "I am Uncle Al, your friendly camp director. I hope you enjoyed that welcome to Camp Night Moon." There was no apology for being late, no explanation about the creatures, no real concern about whether anyone had been hurt. Just that grin and a booming voice directing two young counselors in green and white to load up the trunks. The boy named Mike still looked pale, his face drained of color as the group climbed onto the bus. He admitted quietly that he had been really scared. His new friend reassured him that they were okay now, that the fun was about to start. Mike managed a thin smile, though mostly what he could think about was food. He had not eaten all day, and his stomach was making sure everyone knew it. One of the counselors overheard and told him, with a sly grin, that he would not be hungry once he tasted the camp food. The bus ride turned out to be less than 5 minutes, which puzzled everyone. Why had the first bus dropped them so far away in the first place? Nobody asked the question out loud. A large wooden sign for Camp Night Moon appeared, and Uncle Al turned down a gravel road that wound through a patch of short trees. They crossed the green river, dropped the 4 girls off at the girls' camp, and then pulled into the boys' side. Through the window, small white cabins lined up in a row, and up on a gently sloping hill sat a large white shingled building that looked like a lodge or mess hall. At the edge of a field, 3 counselors were working to get a fire going in a big stone barbecue pit. The sight of it hit like a warm wave. A cookout, real food. Mike was practically drooling. Uncle Hall pulled himself up from the driver's seat and turned to face them. "Welcome to beautiful Camp Night Moon," he bellowed. "Step down and line up for your bunk assignments." The cool air outside smelled sweet and fresh, and the soft rush of a river could be heard somewhere behind a thick row of evergreens. Even if it could not be seen, the excitement building in the group was real. The terror at the platform was fading fast. 4 boys ended up assigned to bunk C together. It was a small, low-ceilinged room with bunk beds along 3 walls, a tall dresser on the 4th, and barely enough space in the middle to turn around. One bed had already been claimed, its green blanket neatly tucked, a radio and some sports magazines on top. Their counselor, they figured. The 4 boys sorted out their sleeping arrangements, with the usual pushing and bickering, Jay claiming a top bunk, Colin taking the one below, and Mike asking almost apologetically for a lower bed because he was afraid of rolling out of a top one at night. The counselor himself arrived shortly after. He was tall and very skinny with red hair and dark freckles, dropping a large grey plastic bag full of bedding onto the floor. with a groan. He introduced himself as Larry, pointed at the bag, told them to make their beds as neat as his, warned them to keep away from his stuff, and walked right back out the door. It slammed behind him. "Real friendly," Jay muttered. The others laughed, though there was something a little uneasy underneath it. They dug into the bag for sheets and blankets. Jay and Colin immediately got into a wrestling match over which blanket was softer. The bunk was filling up with exactly the kind of noise and roughhousing that comes when boys who barely know each other are forced into close quarters and starting to feel comfortable. The fear of the platform was almost gone now. Almost. One boy had just started climbing the ladder to tuck in his top bunk sheet when the scream cut through the room. It was Mike. And whatever had frightened him, the chapter left that answer hanging in the air like smoke. Mike was right beneath the narrator, making his bed when the scream tore through the cabin so suddenly that the narrator cried out and nearly fell off the ladder. He leaped down, heart hammering, and stepped beside his bunkmate. Mike had backed away from his bed, mouth wide open in pure horror, staring straight ahead at something the others couldn't yet see. "What is wrong? What is it, Snakes?" Mike stammered. "Real ones." The others weren't buying it at first. Colin laughed. Jay grinned, assuming it was one of Larry's old rubber snake pranks. But when Jay took a few steps toward the bed, he stopped dead. The two snakes came into focus, rising from the shadows, arching their long skinny bodies, heads pulled back and ready to strike. Their tongues flicked side to side. They were angry, and they were very real. Mike, already pale with fear, told them quietly that he was scared of snakes. Jay, trying to lighten the moment, gave him a playful shove toward the bed. He only meant to rattle him a little, but Mike stumbled and fell directly onto the mattress. The snakes struck in unison. One of them clamped its teeth into the back of Mike's hand. He stood up slowly, not reacting at first. Then came the shriek. 2 drops of blood rose on his skin. He grabbed his hand, breathing in hard, ragged heaves, his face going the color of chalk. Jay rushed forward, full of guilt, apologizing over and over, but Mike wasn't listening. His hand was throbbing with pain, and he burst out of the cabin at a dead run, the door slamming shut behind him. Jay stood there in the quiet, his voice trailing off as he explained to the others that he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. He was just joking, just trying to scare him a little. But now 2 real snakes were coiled on Mike's lower bunk, hissing and ready to go again. Something had to be done. The narrator had a plan. The snakes had moved onto Mike's sheet. If they were fast enough, the 2 of them could wrap the snakes up inside the sheet like a bundle and carry them outside before the snakes even knew what was happening. Colin wasn't convinced, pointing out that they could still get bitten through the fabric. Jay, feeling the weight of what had happened to Mike, said he was in. They crept toward the bed, eyes locked on the snakes, and on the count of 3 they grabbed opposite ends of the sheet and pulled the whole thing up, bringing the corners together into a wriggling, swaying bundle. Inside, the snakes snapped their jaws and thrashed furiously. The bottom of the bundle swung back and forth, like something alive and furious. Because it was. They moved fast. The narrator shouldering open the cabin door, the 2 of them running across the grass with their arms stretched as far from the bundle as possible. One snake had already started pushing its head through the opening. They ran past the cabins toward a clump of shrubs and a patch of low trees beyond them. When they reached the trees, they swung the bundle back and heaved the entire sheet into the air. It opened as it hit the ground. Both snakes slithered out instantly and pulled themselves deep into the shelter of the evergreens. Jay and the narrator stood there hunched over, hands on their knees, breathing hard and saying nothing for a long moment. The snakes were gone. The danger was over. They carried Mike's sheet back to the cabin, where Colin had calmly been unpacking his trunk the whole time, shoving things into his dresser drawer as though nothing had happened. Jay told him they had both been bitten twice. Colin laughed and told him he was a terrible liar, which was true. He called the narrator a hero, which made Jay's sarcasm come out sharp and clear. Then Larry poked his freckled head through the cabin door, asking why nobody was finished unpacking yet, and why the fourth kid wasn't around. When the narrator told him Mike had been bitten by a snake and had gone to find the nurse, Larry's face stayed completely blank. He didn't look surprised at all. He just asked casually where Mike had gone. To the nurse, the narrator repeated. His hand was bleeding, and then Larry threw his head back and started laughing hard, the kind of laugh that made the room feel suddenly colder. "Nurse," he cried. "What nurse?" The trouble started before the campfire even began. Mike came back through the cabin door, pale-faced and frightened, cradling his wounded hand. The camp had no nurse, he told Billy, no nurse at all. The hand was already stained with bright red blood, drops of it splashing onto the cabin floor as he stood there helplessly. Larry, their tall and quietly serious counselor, dug a slender black case from beneath his bunk and handed Mike a roll of bandages. His advice was blunt and unsentimental. Go wash the hand in the washroom, bandage it up, and hurry, because dinner was almost ready. There was no coddling at Camp Night Moon. Larry made that clear. Before Mike rushed off, Larry turned his attention to Billy and asked how the boys had managed to clear the snakes out of the cabin. Jay pointed straight at Billy. It was his idea, he said. Larry stared at Billy for a long moment and told him he was impressed, that it had taken real bravery. Billy felt a small swell of pride and mentioned that maybe it ran in the family. His parents were scientists and explorers, the kind of people who disappeared into the wildest corners of the earth for months at a time. Larry nodded. Then his expression shifted into something more serious. He warned them both to be careful. Camp Night Moon, he said, was no place to let your guard down. Dinner helped loosen the knot of tension that had been tightening all afternoon. The hot dogs were charred black, burned beyond any reasonable standard of cooking, but the boys were so hungry they devoured them without complaint. Billy pushed 3 of them down in under 5 minutes, barely pausing to breathe. Jay, who grumbled about everything, still managed to eat 4 or 5 himself. Mike struggled with his bandaged hand, nearly crying when his first hot dog dropped into the dirt. But by the end of the meal he was in better spirits, saying the throbbing had eased a little. The campfire itself was set in a wide, flat clearing, ringed by smooth white stones. The big white lodge loomed behind them on the slope, and ahead, a thick wall of evergreen trees hid the river from view. Through a small gap in the branches, Billy could see a distant fire flickering on the other side. He wondered if that was the girls' camp. He thought of Dawn and Dory, and whether the 2 camps would ever cross paths. Then Uncle Al rose to his feet. The camp director waved for silence and launched into his welcome speech at a pace that suggested he had delivered it 1,000 times and wanted it done with. Lights out was at 9 sharp. Boys who thought they could sneak out would be wrong, he warned. Boys who thought they might swim or row across the river to the girls' camp would be even more wrong. Groans rippled through the crowd at that, and laughter followed, and even a few of the counselors smiled. Uncle Al did not. Then he told them about the bears. The woods around Camp Night Moon were full of grizzlies and tree bears, he said. They came to the river to drink and to bathe. They were usually hungry. Someone in the crowd let out a growling sound. Someone else screamed and laughed. Uncle Al stared them all down and told them they would not be laughing if a bear clawed their heads off. He called 2 counselors, Larry and Kurt, into the center of the circle, and the 2 young men obediently dropped flat on their stomachs and covered the backs of their heads with their hands. That, Uncle Al explained, was what to do if a grizzly attacked. Lie still. Cover your neck. Do not move, no matter what. Billy called out and asked if there had ever been real bear attacks at the camp. Uncle Al turned toward him and said there had been 2 the previous summer. It was not pretty, he added, and his voice dropped in a way that left the rest to imagination. A cold shiver moved through Billy, but it was what came next that silenced every laugh and whisper around the fire. Uncle Al pointed up the hillside toward a solitary cabin that stood apart from the others, halfway between the camp and the lodge. It leaned at an odd angle, as though the wind had spent years trying to push it over and nearly succeeded. His voice boomed out over the dying crackle of the flames. That cabin, he told them, was known as the Forbidden Bunk. It had been closed and boarded up for many years. No one was to go near it. No one was to speak of it. That set off another wave of nervous laughter and shouted questions. Why was it forbidden? Someone called out. We never talk about it. Uncle O replied, sharp and final. Jay leaned close to Billy and whispered that they should go check it out. Billy laughed, then turned back to Jay with a look of real uncertainty. Jay only grinned and said nothing. Uncle Al closed with a reminder that every camper was required to write home to their parents every single day, so their families would know what a wonderful time they were having at Camp Night Moon. As the group broke up and drifted back toward the bunks, Billy noticed Mike looking pale again, cradling his bandaged hand with growing worry. The hand was throbbing, Mike said. It was swelling. He was starting to feel chills. Billy suggested they find Larry, and they hung back near the fire, hoping to catch him. But by the time they pushed through the stream of kids heading the other direction, Larry had vanished into the dark. They walked quickly back along the curve of the hill, the campfire behind them fading from a crackle to a deep purple-red glow. Mike kept his hand held carefully in front of him, murmuring that it really hurt, that he was not just complaining. Then they stopped. Howls tore through the night air, long, hideous howls that echoed off the hillside and seemed to press down from every direction. They were the kind of sounds that could almost belong to an animal, except they were too human for that, too full of something desperate and aware. Mike turned to Billy. Even in the darkness, a fear on his face was plain to see. Those cries, he whispered, they were coming from the Forbidden Bunk. A few minutes later, the narrator and Mike trudged into the cabin, and the air inside was already thick with unease. Jay and Colin sat tensely on their beds, and the first thing out of Mike's mouth was the question everyone was dreading. Where was Larry? Colin told them Larry wasn't there, and Mike's voice climbed toward panic. His hand was swollen and throbbing, and the one person who might know what to do about it was nowhere to be found. Jay offered that Larry should be back soon, but that small comfort was quickly swallowed by something far more unsettling. Through the open window, strange and mournful howls rolled down from somewhere up the hill. The narrator walked to the window and listened hard. Colin guessed it was a prairie cat, but Mike shut that idea down quickly. Prairie cats screech, he said. They don't howl. He knew because they'd studied them in school. Another howl filled the darkness, and Jay's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that only the very brave or the very foolish tend to feel. He suggested it sounded like a man who had been locked up in the Forbidden Bunk for years and years. Mike swallowed hard and asked if Jay really thought so. Jay and Colin laughed, and the tension cracked open just enough for the boys to breathe again. But Mike's hand was still swollen, and the narrator sent him off to wash it and put on a fresh bandage, hoping Larry would show up soon with something useful. Mike complained about there being no nurse, no infirmary, nothing. Colin repeated Larry's earlier words about Uncle Al not liking to coddle anyone. That was enough to set Jay off into a full impression of the camp director, booming warnings about the Forbidden Bunk in a voice that sounded eerily close to the real thing. They all laughed, even Mike, and for a moment the cabin felt almost normal. Then Colin suggested they go to the Forbidden Bunk that very night. Another long and sorrowful howl rolled down the hill from exactly that direction, and Mike went very quiet. He said softly that he didn't think they should go, then slipped out the door to wash his hand. Jay scoffed that Mike was scared. The narrator admitted to feeling a little scared too, pointing to those awful howls as the reason. Jay and Colin laughed that off as well. Colin explained that every camp had something like the Forbidden Bunk, that the camp director made it up to keep kids in line. Jay agreed, saying camp directors loved scaring kids because it was the only fun they had. He puffed out his chest and boomed another impression of Uncle Al, warning that anyone who left the bunk after lights out would never be seen again. Colin said the forbidden bunk was probably completely empty, that it was all just a joke, like camp ghost stories. Every camp had its own version. The narrator asked if he'd ever been to camp before. He hadn't, but he had friends who had told him about theirs. As he spoke, he reached up and pulled off his silver sunglasses for the first time, and the narrator caught a glimpse of bright sky, blue eyes like big blue marbles. A bugle sounded outside, slow and sad, marking lights. Out. The narrator dropped onto Mike's bed and started pulling off shoes, too exhausted to change or wash up, planning to sleep in clothes. Jay made one last push to sneak out and explore the forbidden bunk. The narrator was too tired. Colin was too. He told Jay they'd do it tomorrow night instead, and Jay's face fell in disappointment before he gave in. Then a voice cut through the room and startled all three of them. Larry's head appeared at the window, grinning in from the darkness outside. He said he wouldn't do it if he were them. He told them to listen to Uncle Al. The narrator's mind immediately went to the question of how long Larry had been standing out there, listening, whether he'd been deliberately spying on them. The door opened, and Larry loped in, his grin already fading. He told them Uncle Al wasn't kidding around. Colin replied with heavy sarcasm and pulled his blanket up. Jay tossed a towel across the room and joked about the camp ghost getting them. Larry said quietly that it wasn't a ghost they needed to worry about. His name was Sabre. The word landed strangely. The narrator asked who Sabre was, suddenly wide awake. Larry corrected the question. Sabre wasn't a who. It wasn't it. Colin sneered that Sabre was probably a red-eyed monster who ate a camper every night, and told the narrator flatly that there was no Sabre, that Larry was just spinning another phony camp story. But Larry stopped searching his drawer and looked up at Colin with a calm and serious expression. He said he wasn't trying to scare anyone. He was trying to save them some trouble. The narrator pressed him to explain what Sabre was. Larry pulled out a sweater, pushed the drawer shut, and said only that they didn't want to find out. When the narrator kept pushing, Larry said just one thing more. Sabre would rip your heart out. He said it flatly, like a fact. Not a warning, Jay snickered. Larry snapped that he was serious, that he wasn't kidding. He wrestled his arm into the sweater sleeve and made the boys an offer. If they didn't believe him, he said, go ahead, go outside and meet Sabre for themselves. But before they did, they should leave him a note with their home address, so he'd know where to send their stuff. And on that cheerful note, the cabin fell into an uneasy quiet, with the howls still drifting through the dark outside, and nobody quite sure anymore whether the most frightening thing in Camp Night Moon was the creature called Sabre, or the calm, certain voice of the boy who warned them about it. The morning began with something close to joy, and ended with something that felt very much like dread. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the boys of Camp Night Moon stirred awake. The air was still cool and damp. Birds were singing outside the cabin windows, and for a brief, tender moment, the narrator found himself thinking of home. He thought of his mom and dad and wondered if he should call them, but it was only the second day, and that felt too soon. He pushed the homesickness down and followed the others up the hill to the lodge. Breakfast was loud and enormous. Long rows of tables filled the cavernous redwood hall, and the clatter of dishes and cups crashed against the high ceiling like thunder. Scrambled egg squares, bacon strips, fried potatoes, toast, and tall cups of juice disappeared fast. The narrator, hungrier than he ever seemed to get at home, ate every last bite. After breakfast, the boys spilled out into the bright morning sun and were divided into activity groups. Some lucky campers headed straight for the river to swim. The narrator found himself assigned to a scratchball game with Larry and about 12 other boys, including everyone from his bunk. He jogged to catch up to Larry, whose long legs always seemed to be carrying him somewhere urgent, and asked whether they would swim after the game. Larry barely glanced up from his clipboard. Yeah, he guessed so. They were going to work up a sweat. Scratchball was straightforward enough. A batter throws the ball into the air as high and as far as he can. then races the bases before the other team can catch it, tag him, or throw him out. The narrator's friend Jay asked if he had played before. He had. They lined up, took their positions, and the game began. But before the first pitch, trouble made itself known. Mike stepped up to Larry, cradling his bandaged hand, his face tight with pain. He said he didn't think he could play. The hand was throbbing, he said. The pain was shooting up and down his side. He lifted it toward Larry's face to show how badly it had swelled. Larry told him not to whine. When Mike pushed back, asking at least for some medicine, Larry pointed him toward a clump of shady trees at the edge of the field and told him they would talk about it later. Then he turned away and blew the whistle. Once the game began, the narrator let himself get swept up in it. The playing was fast and competitive, much better than the casual games back home on the playground. His first trip to the batter's square sent the ball right into a fielder's hands. His second got him all the way to 3 bases before he was tagged. Larry, for his part, was extraordinary. When he came to bat, he hurled the ball harder than anyone else, watching it sail clean over the fielders' heads, and then ran the bases with a long, effortless stride that made it look easy. By the 4th inning, the blue team was ahead 12-6. They were hot and sweaty and ready for that swim. But it was during these middle innings that the narrator began to notice Colin. Colin was not athletic. He had long, skinny arms with no muscle to speak of, and he ran awkwardly. He seemed to be the only player not enjoying himself. He had been tagged out twice and had missed an easy catch in the field. He argued with a player on the narrator's team about a foul call, and then got into a heated shouting match with Larry himself over whether a ball should have been ruled out. Larry finally ordered Colin to shut up and get back to the outfield. Colin obeyed, grudgingly. The narrator didn't think much of it. Arguments like that happen all the time in ball games. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was the next inning. Colin's team was at bat, and Colin stepped up to the batter's square. Larry was playing the outfield. The narrator was nearby. Colin tossed the ball high, but it didn't go far. Both Larry and the narrator came running in to get it. Larry reached it first, picking it off the first bounce. He drew back his arm to throw, and then the narrator saw his face change. Larry's features tightened, his copper-colored eyebrows lowered. His eyes narrowed with a look of pure, focused anger. Then, with a loud grunt of effort, he hurled the ball as hard as he could, directly at the back of Colin's head. It struck with a sharp crack. Colin's silver sunglasses flew through the air. A short, high-pitched cry escaped his throat. His arms flew up as if he had been shot. His knees buckled, and then he collapsed face down on the grass and did not move. The ball rolled away slowly over the green field. The narrator cried out in shock. And then he watched Larry's expression shift again, instantly, like a mask being pulled on. His eyes went wide. His mouth fell open in something that looked like horror. It slipped. Larry was already shouting as he ran toward Colin. I didn't mean to throw it at him. It just slipped. The narrator sank to his knees on the ground. He felt dizzy and sick and deeply confused. He knew what he had seen. He had seen the anger on Larry's face before the throw. He forced himself to stand and join the circle of boys gathering around Colin. Larry was kneeling over him, raising Colin's head off the ground gently, mopping his forehead with a red bandana from around Colin's neck. Colin's eyes were open, rolling slowly, and low moans were escaping him. Larry kept saying the ball had slipped. He kept saying he was sorry. Then Larry told 2 boys from the red team to help him carry Colin to the lodge, and instructed the rest to get changed for their swim. The narrator watched them hoist Colin up and start toward the hill. He followed without quite deciding to. The sick feeling in his stomach had not gone away. He could not stop seeing that expression on Larry's face, the tightened jaw, the narrowed eyes, the deliberate fury of the throw. He knew it had been no accident. As they neared the bottom of the hill, Mike came running up alongside Larry, his swollen hand held out, his voice pleading. He begged to come along, Someone had to look at his hand. It was really bad. Larry told him yes, he had better come. The narrator stood in the hot sun and watched them disappear up toward the lodge, and a chill moved through him despite the heat. Something was wrong here. Something was terribly, deeply wrong, and though he could not have known it yet, the horrors he had witnessed that morning were only the very beginning. Later that afternoon, Billy and Jay were up in their bunks, writing letters home. The quiet of the nearly empty cabin pressed down on them, and Billy could not stop seeing it in his mind. Larry's face, twisted with anger, hurling that ball straight at the back of Colin's head. He wrote about it in his letter. He told his parents about the missing nurse, about the forbidden bunk, about all of it. When Jay looked up from his own letter, red-faced and peeling from the sun, he gestured around the hollow cabin and said they were dropping like flies. Billy agreed, and then something inside him cracked open. He blurted it out. Larry had done it on purpose. He had deliberately thrown at Colin's head. Jay's hand went still. He stared across the bunk at Billy with quiet disbelief and said that was impossible. Larry was their counselor. His hand had slipped, that was all. Billy started to argue, but the cabin door swung open and there was Colin, still on his feet but barely, with Larry right beside him holding his arm. Billy and Jay dropped from their bunks and rushed over. Colin forced a thin smile and admitted he was seeing double, that the cabin looked crowded to him because there were two of each of them. Jay and Billy laughed, the kind of laugh that has no joy in it at all. Larry helped Colin to his lower bunk, cheerful as ever, telling them Colin would be just fine in a day or two. Billy asked if Colin had seen a doctor. Just Uncle Al, Colin said. Uncle Al had looked it over and said he'd be fine. Billy shot a suspicious glance at Larry, but Larry had already turned his back, crouching down to dig through his duffel bag under the bed. When Billy pressed about Mike, asking where he was and whether he was coming back, Larry brushed every question aside. He stood up, told the boys to finish their letters and get changed for dinner, and then, almost as an afterthought, reminded them that tonight was tent night. They were sleeping outside. The boys groaned. Jay called after him, asking for something to put on his sunburn. Larry said no and walked out the door. Up at the lodge, the mess hall was loud and wild as always. Billy, Jay, and Colin sat near the window, where a cool breeze came through. The councillors, dressed in their green and white, sat in the far corner and paid no attention to any of them. The food was grey meat with potatoes and gravy. Not good, but Billy was hungry enough not to care. Colin barely touched his plate. Halfway through dinner, Jay and a boy named Roger started wrestling over a breadstick. Jay yanked it free and knocked his entire cup of grape juice straight into Billy's lap. The purple stain spread across his tan shorts while the whole table erupted. Roger shouted that Billy had had an accident. Jay announced he had purpled in his pants. Breadsticks flew. The laughter rolled on, and Billy decided to run back to the bunk and change before dessert. He sprinted down the hill, pushed through the cabin door, and yanked open a dresser drawer. It was empty, completely cleaned out. For a moment he stood there confused, and then he understood. He had opened the wrong drawer. He had opened Mike's drawer. He turned and looked for Mike's trunk, which had been stacked behind the bunk. The trunk was gone too. Mike was not coming back. Billy ran back to the mess hall without changing his shorts. He pushed through the noise and found Larry at the councillor's table, deep in conversation with a heavy guy with long, scraggly blonde hair. Billy grabbed Larry's shoulder and cried out that Mike was gone, that his things had been cleared out completely. Larry turned around slowly, his expression more annoyed than concerned, and told Billy to go back to his table. Billy refused to move. He asked what had happened to Mike, whether someone had sent him home. Larry shrugged and looked down, said maybe, said he didn't know. The scraggly-haired councillor beside him smirked and said Mike had probably gone for a swim. Some of the other councillors laughed. Billy felt sick. He felt a quiet, creeping fear settle into his chest as he asked himself whether any of the councillors at this camp actually cared what happened to them. Back at the table, Colin figured Uncle Al had sent Mike home because of his badly swollen hand. Jay said counsellors just didn't like talking about bad stuff because it might give the poor little kids nightmares, and then launched a gob of pudding at Roger's forehead, which started a full war down the length of the table. Mike was not mentioned again. After dinner, Uncle Al talked up tent night and taught everyone the camp songs, making them sing each one over and over until it stuck. Billy didn't feel much like singing, but Jay and Roger started rewriting the words with spectacularly gross variations, and soon enough a whole group of them were belting out their rude versions at full volume, and it was hard not to laugh. Later they made their way down the hill under a cool and star-washed sky. Billy walked beside Colin, steadying him. Jay and Roger walked just ahead, bumping shoulders back and forth. Then Jay turned around, eyes bright with that devilish grin of his, and said in a low voice that tonight was the night. Tonight, when everyone was asleep, he and Roger were going to go check out the forbidden bunk. He asked Colin first. Colin shook his head sadly. He was still seeing double and too weak to try. Then Jay fixed his eyes on Billy and kept walking backward, the grin holding steady on his sunburned face. He asked Billy if he was coming. The night had barely settled over the camp when the first test of nerve arrived, and not everyone was willing to face it. When Jay and Roger began whispering their plans to sneak up to the forbidden bunk, the narrator quietly stepped back. He told them he would stay with Colin instead. Roger muttered something under his breath, something that sounded an awful lot like the word chicken. Jay looked genuinely disappointed, but the narrator was tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhausted that makes even your hair ache, and he meant it when he said he needed rest. The two adventurers plotted in hushed voices all the way back to the tent area. At the bottom of the hill, the narrator stopped and looked up at the forbidden bunk. It seemed to lean toward him in the pale starlight, like something alive and curious. He waited for the howls he had heard before, those familiar, unsettling sounds that seemed to breathe from inside the old structure. But tonight there was nothing, only a heavy, pressing silence. Inside the plastic tent, the ground was unyielding and cold, and the air was thick and damp. The narrator stretched out on top of his sleeping bag and tried to make peace with the discomfort. It seemed weird without Mike there, he said aloud, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Jay brushed the thought off casually. Colin sat quietly, still not feeling himself. Time crawled. A bug crossed the narrator's forehead, and he squashed it without ceremony. He could hear Jay and Colin whispering behind him, too low to understand. Jay snickered nervously at something. Eventually, sleep crept in whether he wanted it to or not. He was jolted awake by the sound of whispering just outside the tent. Roger's face appeared at the opening, pale and eager. Jay was right behind him, a large shadowy shape crawling toward the door. "Wish us luck," Jay breathed. The narrator whispered it back, his voice thick with sleep. Then Jay pushed the tent flap open, and a square of purple sky appeared for just a moment before he vanished into the dark. The narrator shivered. He turned to Colin and suggested they sneak back to the bunk. The ground was like solid rock, and the warmth of the cabin was too tempting to ignore. Colin agreed without argument, and the two of them slipped away quietly, making their way to the window to watch for the others. "They're going to get caught," the narrator whispered with certainty. Colin disagreed, but offered his own gloomy prediction. There was nothing to see up there. He said it was just a stupid cabin. Leaning out the window into the cold night air, the narrator could actually hear Jay and Roger out in the darkness, their quiet giggling and the sound of legs pushing through tall grass. Colin muttered that they were making too much noise. The camp around them was so silent it felt almost wrong, the kind of silence that listens back. They must be up the hill by now, the narrator whispered, straining his eyes into the blackness. And then the first scream arrived. It tore through the silence like something physical, a scream of pure horror that yanked the narrator's head back inside the window. "Was that Jay or Roger?" Colin asked, his voice shaking. The second scream answered by being worse than the first, and beneath it, rising up like an eruption of thunder, came animal snarls, loud, furious, and terrible. Then came Jay's voice, cracked and desperate. "Help us, please. Somebody help us." The narrator's heart was hammering as he lurched to the cabin door and threw it open. He ran out barefoot into the wet grass, the dew soaking his feet instantly. He was calling Jay's name before he even realized he was doing it, his own voice sounding strange and shrill and frightened to his own ears. Then he saw it, a dark shape running toward him through the night, bent low, arms stretched out. It was Jay. His face was twisted in horror, his eyes wide and unblinking, his bushy hair practically standing on end. He ran up to the narrator, chest heaving, struggling to straighten himself. "It got Roger," he moaned. "It tore Roger to pieces." Jay let out a broken sob. Then his eyes flew open, and he spun around, staring back into the darkness behind him, his face collapsing into pure terror. "Here it comes!" he shrieked. "Now it is coming after us!" In the pale starlight, Jay's eyes rolled back in his head, his knees buckled, and he began to slump toward the ground. There was no time to think. The narrator grabbed him before he fell and dragged him inside the cabin. Colin slammed the door shut behind them. Inside, Jay recovered slowly, his shoulders heaving, his face as pale as a bedsheet. His breath came out in short, frightened moans. The three of them froze in place and listened hard. The air hung frozen and still. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No animal approaching. Just Jay's terrified moans and the pounding of a heart, too scared to stay quiet. And then it came. Somewhere far in the distance, a howl rose up on the wind, soft and low at first, then climbing higher, curling through the dark like something alive. A howl that chilled the blood and pulled a cry from deep in the chest. "It is Sabre. Don't let it get me," Jay shrieked, covering his face with his hands and dropping to his knees on the cabin floor. "Don't let it get me." Colin was huddled against the wall, pressed away from the window. "We have to get Larry," the narrator managed to choke out. "We have to get help." "But how?" Colin demanded in a trembling voice. "Don't let it get me," Jay repeated, crumpled on the floor. "It isn't coming here," the narrator told him, fighting to sound certain, fighting to sound soothing. "We're okay inside the bunk, Jay. It isn't coming here, but it got Roger." Jay started. His entire body shook with a convulsion of pure terror. Thinking about Roger, a stab of fear cut straight through. Was it really true? Had Roger actually been attacked by some creature out there in the dark? Had he truly been slashed to pieces? Those two blood-curdling screams from the hillside had been so loud, so horrifying. Hadn't anyone else in camp heard them? Hadn't any other kids heard Roger's cries? Hadn't any counselors heard? Another frozen moment, another stretch of silence. Only the whisper of the breeze rustling through the leaves. No voices, no cries of alarm, no hurried footsteps. Colin had helped Jay over to his bunk. "Where can Larry be?" Colin asked. His eyes, for once not hidden behind those silver sunglasses, showed real, undeniable fear. "Where can everyone be?" the narrator asked, crossing both arms over the chest and pacing back and forth in the small space between the beds. "There isn't a sound out there." And then Jay's eyes went wide with horror. He was staring straight at the open window. "The creature!" he cried. "Here it comes. It is coming through the window." All three of them stood frozen, gaping in horror at the open window. But nothing came through. Only darkness stared back, fringed by a pale scatter of stars. Out in the trees, crickets started up their shrill clatter, and the camp fell utterly silent beyond that. Jay was so frightened he was shaking, barely able to hold himself together. Somehow the narrator and Colin got him calmed down enough to pull off his sneakers and lie down. They piled 3 blankets over him to stop the trembling. Both of them desperately wanted to run for help, but neither one could bring himself to step outside into the dark. So the three of them sat awake through the whole long night. Waiting Larry never showed up. Not once. The narrator must have finally dozed off just before dawn, slipping into strange, restless nightmares about fires and people running. He was jolted awake by Colin shaking him hard. "Breakfast," Colin said hoarsely. They were late. Jay was already at the cabin door, sneakers untied, desperate to find Larry and tell him everything. The three of them stumbled up the hill in the cool grey morning, the sun struggling weakly through a ceiling of white clouds. They slowed halfway to the mess hall, all three of them reluctantly letting their eyes drift toward the forbidden bunk. There was nothing there. No sign of Roger, no sign of struggle, no dried blood on the ground. The tall grass was not bent or matted down. Just nothing. "Weird," Jay muttered, shaking his head. Inside the mess hall, everything was maddeningly normal. Kids laughed and shouted to each other as if the world had not come apart the night before. No announcement had been made about Roger. The three of them ignored everyone who called out to them and moved quickly up and down the aisles, searching every face. Roger was not there. The sick, heavy feeling in the narrator's stomach grew heavier with every empty table they passed. They found Larry at the counselor's corner, halfway through a big plate of scrambled eggs and bacon. All three of them hit him at once, voices tumbling over each other. "What happened to Roger? Is he okay? Where were you?" "We were attacked. We were too scared to come find you." Larry raised both hands to slow them down. His face was confused. When Jay screamed about the creature that had jumped on Roger, Larry glanced sideways at the other counselors, who looked just as baffled. A podgy counselor named Derek sat beside him. Larry asked if Derek had heard anything in his area. Derek shook his head. "Did not even have Roger in his group," he said. Larry pointed out that if a camper had been attacked by a bear, there would have been screams. Everyone would have heard. Derek nodded along calmly, suggesting bears had been spotted downriver just the afternoon before. Jay's face went a deeper red. He screamed that it was not a bear. It was a creature. He screamed that nobody was listening. Larry pressed him, asking when and where, and his tone shifted slightly when Jay admitted they had gone up to the forbidden bunk after lights. Larry shook his head. He said he would ask Uncle Al about it after breakfast, and that Jay had probably just had a bad nightmare. He turned back to his eggs and lifted a strip of bacon to his mouth. Jay's voice cracked. He cried out, asking whether Larry even cared what happened to them. Kids all around the mess hall had stopped eating to stare. The narrator pulled Jay away and tried to get him moving toward their table. But Jay would not leave without searching the entire hall one more time. They walked every aisle again, checking every single face. One thing was absolutely certain by the end of it. Roger was nowhere in that room. The sun had finally burned through the clouds by the time they reached the waterfront for morning swim. The air was still cool, the thick shrubs along the river bank glittering wet in the white glare of morning light. Colin was barely standing, wrung out from the sleepless night. Jay was frantic, his red hair half standing on end, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot, demanding to know where Larry was. Then Larry appeared from the bushes behind them, wearing his baggy green Camp Night Moon swim trunks. His expression was serious, his eyes locking straight onto Jay's. He told them what Uncle had said. He and Uncle Al had walked all around the forbidden bunk. There was no sign of any attack. There could not have been. Jay started to protest again, insisting the creature had slashed Roger, insisting he had seen it with his own eyes. Larry shook his head slowly, his voice going softer and more deliberate. He said there was one more thing. He and Uncle Al had gone up to the office and checked the records. Every name, every camper enrolled at Camp Night Moon that summer. There was no camper named Roger. Not a first name, not a middle name, no Roger anywhere at all. Jay's mouth dropped open, and he let out a low gasp. The three of them stood there in disbelief, staring at Larry, letting the startling news wash over them like cold water. "Simone's made a mistake," Jay said finally, his voice trembling with emotion. "We searched the mess hall for him, Larry, And he is gone, Roger isn't here. He never was here, Larry said without any emotion at all. I just don't believe this, Jay cried. Larry glanced toward the water and casually motioned to the lake. How about a swim, guys? The narrator demanded to know what Larry thought had happened the night before. He couldn't believe how calm Larry was being, how completely unbothered he seemed by all of it. Larry only shrugged. He said he didn't know what to think, his eyes drifting out toward the cluster of swimmers farthest from shore. Then he suggested with another shrug that maybe the boys were trying to pull some kind of weird joke on him. Jay's voice shot up in disbelief. A joke, that is what Larry thought this was. Larry shrugged again and told them to get some exercise. Before Jay could say another word, Larry turned and went running into the green water, taking 4 or 5 running steps off the shore before diving in, pulling himself forward with long, steady strokes. Jay refused to go in. He announced he was going back to the bunk, his face bright red, his chin trembling. He was close to tears. He turned and began running through the bushes, dragging his towel along the ground behind him. Colin went sprinting after him. The narrator stood alone on the shore, trying to decide what to do. Following Jay to the bunk didn't feel right. There was nothing he could do to help him anyway. Maybe a cold swim would make him feel better. Then again, maybe nothing would make him feel better. He stared glumly out at the other guys laughing and splashing in the water. Larry and another counselor were lining everyone up for a race, debating what kind of stroke to use. They all seemed to be having a wonderful time. So why wasn't he? Why had he felt so frightened and miserable ever since he arrived at this camp? Why didn't the other campers seem to notice how strange and unsettling this place truly was? He shook his head, unable to answer any of those questions. He needed a swim. He took one step toward the water, and then a hand reached out from the bushes and grabbed him roughly from behind. He opened his mouth to scream, but his attacker was fast, and a hand clamped hard over his mouth before a single sound could escape. Something was very wrong at Camp Night Moon, and Billy was about to find out just how far the wrongness spread. It began with a pair of hands yanking him backward into the bushes. He thrashed and stumbled, crashing headfirst into a thick clump of green leaves before scrambling upright, heart-pounding, ready to face whoever had grabbed him. What he found instead stopped him cold. It was Dawn, his sister, dripping wet in a blue one-piece bathing suit, her blonde hair plastered against her bare shoulders. She pressed a finger to her lips and hissed at him to get down. Crouching beside her in the dirt was Dory, Dawn's friend, red curls soaked and wild, her face tight with worry. They had swum across the river from the girls' camp that very morning, they told him in urgent whispers, and they had been hiding in those bushes ever since, waiting for a chance to reach him. Billy whispered back that they were not supposed to be there, that if anyone caught them there would be trouble, but Dawn cut him off. They had not come all this way to talk about rules. The girls' camp was a nightmare. That was the word they used. Everyone over there had stopped calling it Camp Night Moon and started calling it Camp Nightmare instead. Strange things were happening, scary things. Girls had simply vanished, one after another, and the counselors carried on as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. One disappearance had been explained away as a bear attack. The other 2 had no explanation offered whatsoever. They were just gone, Dawn said, her voice catching on the words. Billy felt the cold spread through his chest as he listened. He told them about Mike, about Roger, about Jay and the attack at the forbidden bunk. Dawn and Dory listened in wide-eyed silence. Just like at their camp, Dawn breathed. Dory said they had to do something. They had to get the boys and girls together and make a plan. When Billy asked if she meant a plan to escape, both girls nodded without hesitation. Every day another girl disappeared. Dawn said grimly, the counselors acted as if nothing was happening. They could not stay there and wait to see what happened next. Billy asked whether they had written home. They had written every day, Dory told him, but not a single letter had come back. That landed like a stone in still water, because Billy had been at camp for nearly a week, and he had not received one piece of mail either. Despite both his parents promising to write every day, he tried to offer some comfort. Visitors' Day was next week, he reminded them. Their parents would come, and they could tell them everything face to face. Dawn looked at him with those dark, serious eyes, and said it might already be too late. Dory said she had not slept in 2 nights. She kept hearing horrible screams outside in the dark. A whistle blew nearby. The swimmers were coming back in from the water. There was no more time, Dawn told him. She and Dory would swim back when the shore was clear, and that they should try to meet in this same spot the day after tomorrow. Billy told them to be careful. They told him the same. Then they slipped deeper into the bushes, and Billy stood up, crouched low until he was clear of the leaves, and ran. His mind was spinning as he moved. He wanted to find Colin and Jay and tell them everything. And then, halfway to the bunks, a thought struck him so obvious and so hopeful that he nearly laughed out loud. The payphone, he had seen it once, on the side of the lodge wall. Someone had told him it was the only phone campers were allowed to use. He could call his parents right now. He could tell them everything, and they could come and get him, and Jay and Colin and Dawn and Dory too. The thought lifted him off the ground. He turned away from the field and jogged up the hill toward the lodge, his heart rising with every step. He pictured his parents picking up the phone. He pictured his mother's voice. Of course they would believe him. They always believed him. The dark shape of the payphone came into view against the white lodge wall, and Billy broke into a full sprint. He bent forward to catch his breath when he reached it, hands on his knees, chest heaving. Then he reached up and grabbed the receiver, and gasped. It was plastic, a thin sheet of molded plastic nailed to the wall, shaped to look exactly like a telephone, not real, not connected to anything, not a phone at all, a prop, a fake. They did not want the campus calling out. That was the only thought his mind could form as the cold crept back into him. Sharper than before, heavier now with something close to dread. He turned away from the wall, his head spinning with bitter disappointment, and walked straight into Uncle Al. Something was very wrong at Camp Night Moon, and Billy was beginning to feel it in his bones. It started at the top of the hill, outside the lodge, where Billy had gone looking for a phone. He had been hoping to call his parents, to hear a familiar voice, to feel less alone in this strange place. Instead, he found Uncle Al, the camp director, broad-shouldered and suspicious, fingering his yellow mustache and watching Billy with careful eyes. The phone on the wall, it turned out, was a joke, a plastic prop someone had hung up for laughs. And even if a real phone existed somewhere on these grounds, it did not matter. Campers were not allowed to call out. It was a rule, Uncle Al said sharply, with a tone that closed the door on any further discussion. He suggested Billy write a letter instead, then cheerfully mentioned a canoe trip scheduled for the very next day, squeezed his shoulder, and walked away. Billy stood there watching him go, feeling the heat of embarrassment cool into something heavier and colder. A letter. Fine. He would write a letter. He found Colin and Jay lounging beside the bunk, Colin stretched out shirtless in the grass, Jay pulling up long blades of it and tossing them aside one by one. Billy brought them inside and closed the door. Then he told them everything. He told them about Dawn and Dory, the girls from the camp across the lake who had been scared enough to swim through dark water and wait in the shadows just to deliver a warning. The boys listened with wide eyes. The girls thought they all needed to get organized, or escape, or do something. The situation was serious enough that 2 frightened kids had risked getting caught just to say so. The 3 of them made a quiet agreement right there in the bunk. They would each write to their parents. Visitors' Day was coming next week, and they would make sure their families understood they needed to come home. Billy pulled out his paper and pen and got to work immediately, the words coming fast and urgent. He was still writing when he paused to ask his bunkmates whether they knew about the canoe trip Uncle had mentioned. That was when he learned about the hike, a 3-mile hike that afternoon, led by a tall counselor named Frank. Colin and Jay had been told, Billy had not. He chewed on the end of his pen and tried not to feel the creeping sense that he was always just slightly outside the circle of information, always the last to know. Lunch did not help. The pizza was cold and tasted like cardboard and stuck to the roof of his mouth. He barely touched it. His mind kept drifting back to Dawn and Dory, their fear, their desperation. He wondered when he would see them again. After lunch, Frank came and collected Colin and Jay for the hike, explaining with a grin that the trail got a little dangerous and he could only take 2 at a time. Billy asked if he was supposed to come along. He was not on the list. He watched his bunkmates walk out of the mess hall and felt the hollow ache of being left behind. Then Larry appeared with a hand on his shoulder and a grin on his face, and news that Billy was representing Bunk 4 in the tennis tournament. Billy protested that he was a terrible player. Larry told him they were counting on him and pointed him toward the courts. The afternoon passed in sweat and aching muscles. Billy beat a younger boy who looked like he had never held a racket before, then lost a long grinding match to one of the blond boys from the mess hall. He swam afterward, changed his clothes, and returned to the bunk to finish the letter. Jay and Colin still were not back from their hike. Billy held the finished envelope tightly as he climbed the hill toward the lodge. The camp office was around back, its door wide open, but when he leaned over the counter and called out, no one answered. The office was empty. He was about to leave when he spotted it, a large burlap mailbag on the floor of the small dark back room. He slipped around the counter, crouched down, and started to push his envelope inside. A cluster of letters spilled out onto the floor, and as he reached to gather them up, one caught his eye. It was his own handwriting, his parents' address, a letter he had written the day before. He reached back in and pulled out a larger handful. There was a letter from Colin. He pulled out more, and there, mixed in among the rest, were 2 letters Billy himself had written during his very first days at camp. Every single one of them was still here, sitting in this bag, unread, unsent, going nowhere. Billy knelt on the floor of that dark little room with his hands trembling, and the envelopes scattered around him, and the truth settled over him like something cold and heavy. They could not call home, and now he knew they could not write home either. Every attempt to reach the outside world had been quietly, carefully stopped. He stuffed the envelopes back into the bag with shaking fingers, his mind racing. What was going on here? What exactly was going on? By the time Billy slipped into the mess hall, Uncle Al was already wrapping up the evening announcements. He slid into his seat, still shaken from what he had discovered about the mailbag. He expected to see Jay and Colin across the table from him, but their places on the bench were empty. That was strange. A cold unease settled over him. He wanted to tell them what he had found, wanted to share the terrible news that their parents were never receiving any of the letters they wrote. And worse, the camp had to be keeping the letters from home away from the boys as well. But Jay and Colin were not there to hear any of it. The fried chicken was greasy. The mashed potatoes tasted like paste. Billy forced the food down and kept glancing at the mess hall door, waiting, watching. They never showed up. A heavy dread pooled in his stomach as he looked through the window and saw that darkness had already fallen outside. A 3-mile hike should not take this long. He pulled himself up and walked to the counselor's table in the corner, where Larry was in the middle of a loud argument about sports. Billy interrupted, asking whether Frank had returned. Larry glanced at the empty chair beside him and shrugged. "Guess not," he said, and went right back to his argument without another word. After dinner, the tables were pushed aside and everyone played indoor relay races. The cheers echoed off the high-raftered ceiling, but Billy was too worried to enjoy any of it. He told himself maybe Jay and Colin had decided to camp overnight. But he had watched them leave, and he knew they had taken no tents, no sleeping bags, nothing that would let them stay out through a dark night. Just before lights out, Larry appeared beside him with a reminder about the canoe trip. They were leaving right after breakfast, Larry explained. Billy was to wear a bathing suit, bring a change of clothes, and meet at the waterfront. Billy gave a hollow reply. He had nearly forgotten about the canoe trip. He forgot even to ask whether Jay and Colin would be coming along. He headed down the dark hill toward the bunk, the tall wet grass slipping under his feet. Halfway down he could see the dark outline of the forbidden bunk, hunched against the night like something waiting to strike. He forced himself to look away and jogged the rest of the way to bunk 4. Through the window he could see someone moving around inside. His heart jumped. Colin and Jay were back. He pushed the door open and burst in, calling out to them. He stopped cold and gasped. 2 strangers stared back at him. One sat on the edge of Colin's bunk, pulling off his sneakers. The other stood at the dresser, pulling a T-shirt from one of the drawers. The short-haired boy with a gold stud in his ear introduced himself as Tommy. The other, with long scraggly hair falling over his forehead, said his name was Chris. They had just arrived that day, they said. New campers. Billy's heart was pounding. He pointed at the drawer Tommy had just closed and said that was Jay's drawer, but Tommy said the drawer had been empty when they arrived. Almost all of them were, Chris added. The whole cabin had been empty, as if no one had ever been there at all. Billy sat down on the lower bunk, his legs gone shaky, a million frightening thoughts spinning through his head. He said out loud that something was wrong. Chris and Tommy exchanged a look, but seemed unbothered, settling into their new bunks like nothing was the matter. Tommy asked how long Billy was staying at camp. The question knocked something loose in him, and Billy blurted it out with force. He was not staying. He was leaving on Visitors' Day next week, when his parents came up. But then Tommy looked at him hard, the way someone looks at a person who does not yet know the worst part of the story. Hadn't Billy heard Uncle Al's announcement before dinner? Billy had not. Visitors' Day, Tommy said, had been cancelled. That night, sleep offered Billy no comfort. He drifted in and out of a troubled rest, the blanket pulled tight to his chin against the cold, his mind turning over the same frightening question again and again. Jay and Colin were gone, and nobody seemed willing to explain why. It felt deeply wrong to lie in that bunk, knowing 2 strangers had taken the spots where his friends used to sleep. The darkness outside brought no peace either. Somewhere in the distance, carried through the open bunk windows on the wind, came long and chilling howls. Animal cries, Billy told himself, probably from the forbidden bunk, but knowing that did not make them easier to hear. At one point he was almost certain he could hear kids screaming. He sat bolt upright, heart hammering, and listened hard into the black night, but silence followed, and he could not tell where the dream ended and the waking world began. The fear and confusion twisted together until they were the same thing entirely. By the time a grey and overcast morning arrived, Billy had barely slept. He pulled on his swim trunks and a T-shirt and ran straight to the lodge to find Larry. He searched everywhere. Larry was not at breakfast. None of the other counsellors admitted to knowing a single thing. Frank, the counsellor who had taken Jay and Colin on that hike, was also nowhere to be found. The absence of answers made Billy's dread grow heavier with every passing minute. He finally tracked Larry down at the waterfront, where the counsellor was preparing a long metal canoe for the day's river trip. Billy ran to him breathlessly and cried out his question before he had even fully stopped moving. Larry looked up from an armload of canoe paddles, his expression shifting into something like bewilderment. He assumed Billy was asking about Chris and Tommy and said they would be there soon enough. That was not what Billy wanted to hear. He grabbed Larry's arm and demanded to know about Jay and Colin. His voice climbed higher and higher. He could feel his own pulse thumping at his temples. He told Larry he had to explain what had happened to them, that he had to tell him the truth. Larry pulled free and let the paddles drop to the ground. His reply came in a voice that was very quiet and very still. He said he simply did not know anything about them. He placed a hand on Billy's trembling shoulder and looked directly into his eyes. He made a promise. After the river trip, he would ask Uncle Al about it personally. He would find out for Billy when they returned. Billy stared back at him, trying to read whether those calm, cold eyes were hiding something. He could not be sure. Larry was already pushing the canoe into the shallow water and telling Billy to grab a life-preserver vest and get in. Billy had no real choice but to obey. Chris and Tommy arrived moments later, strapped on their vests without complaint, and soon all four of them were seated cross-legged inside the long canoe, drifting away from shore. The sky stayed dark and heavy, the sun buried behind charcoal clouds. The canoe bumped and bounced over choppy water, and the current proved stronger than any of them had expected. The riverbanks with their low shrubs and trees began sliding past quickly. Larry sat facing the boys from the front and demonstrated the paddling rhythm. He watched with a tight frown as the three of them struggled to find that rhythm. And when they finally caught on, he grinned, turned himself carefully around, and let them do the work. Billy had never paddled a canoe before. It was harder than it looked, but as he fell into the shared rhythm with Tommy and Chris, something unexpected happened. He began to enjoy it. Dark water smacked against the prow and threw up bursts of white froth. The steady effort of rowing warmed him from the inside out until he realized he was actually sweating. They rowed past tangles of yellow and gray, trunked trees. The river split in two, and they shifted their paddles to take the left branch, with Larry working hard to steer them clear of the tall rocks jutting up between the channels. The canoe bobbed and slapped and bobbed again, sending cold water pouring over the sides. Then Larry called back to them. He warned them that the rapids were coming. He told them to hang on, that things were about to get wild. A wave of icy water broke over Billy before he could brace himself. The canoe launched upward on a shelf of rushing white water and crashed back down hard. Behind him, Tommy and Chris laughed with excited energy. Another wave caught him, and Billy cried out, nearly losing his grip on the paddle. He heard the other two laugh again. He pulled in a deep breath, held on tight, and kept the rhythm going. Then Larry did something no one expected. He climbed to his feet. He leaned forward, pointing down into the swirling white water, calling out that they should look at the fish below. But as he leaned, a powerful rush of current struck the canoe and spun it sharply to the right. The startled look on Larry's face said everything. His arm shot forward, and he plunged headfirst into the churning river. Billy screamed his name. He looked back at Tommy and Chris, who had gone completely still, their mouths hanging open in frozen horror. The canoe kept moving. It slid rapidly down the white water, carrying them further from the spot where Larry had gone in. But Larry did not come back up. The surface offered nothing, only swirling dark water and foam. Billy screamed the name over and over. Tommy and Chris joined him, their voices high and frightened. The canoe drifted farther still. Chris shouted back that they could not stop, that none of them knew how. Billy did not allow himself another second of thought. He threw his paddle into the river, stood up in the rocking canoe, and dove into the cold, murky, swirling water to save him. Billy jumped without thinking, and the river swallowed him whole. He hit the cold water and went under immediately, swallowing a mouthful of the dark current before clawing his way back to the surface, sputtering and gasping. His sneakers dragged at his feet like anchors. He should have pulled them off before he leaped. He realized too late. But Larry was out there somewhere, and there was no time for regret. He pulled himself through the heaving water in long, desperate strokes, searching for the spot where Larry had gone in. Behind him, he watched the canoe grow smaller and smaller, carrying Tommy and Chris away. He wanted to shout at them to wait, but he knew it was useless. They had no way to stop. The river was in charge now. Then came the cramp. A sharp, vicious pain exploded through his right leg and shot up his entire side. Billy slipped under the surface, the water rushing over him as the cramp clenched tight. He fought his way back up, gasping, forcing his arms to keep moving, even as his leg refused to cooperate. That was when he spotted something floating just ahead. A piece of driftwood, he thought at first. But no, it was Larry, face down in the water, being carried along by the current. Billy screamed his name. Larry did not answer. With the last of his strength, Billy grabbed Larry by the shoulders, rolled him onto his back, and locked an arm around his neck, the way his parents had taught him. He kicked hard toward the shore, his bad legs still tight and weak. To his relief, the current seemed to shift and help him along. A few moments later, his feet found the muddy bottom, and he dragged Larry up onto the bank. He stretched Larry out on his back and leaned over him, panting like a wild animal, his whole body shaking. Then Larry opened his eyes. He stared up at Billy with a blank, distant look, as if he did not quite recognize the boy kneeling over him. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, he said Billy's name and asked if they were okay. They were okay. After resting, the two of them began the long walk back to camp, following the river upstream. They were soaked through and plastered with mud, but Billy barely noticed. He had saved Larry's life. That truth settled over him like a strange, quiet warmth. They did not talk much on the way. Every step took real effort. Billy used the silence to press Larry one more time about Jay and Colin, the two bunkmates who had simply vanished. He thought that after everything they had just survived, Larry might finally tell him the truth. But Larry raised his hand and swore he knew nothing. Billy stared at him and said that so many frightening things had happened. Larry agreed it had been strange, then went quiet and kept his eyes on the path ahead. 3 hours later, Camp Nightmare came back into view. Billy's knees nearly buckled at the sight of it. Uncle Al spotted them from across the waterfront and came hurrying over in his baggy green sweats, demanding to know what had happened. Before Larry could speak, Billy told him everything. Larry admitted that he had fallen in, that Billy had jumped in and saved him, and that Tommy and Chris had been carried downriver in the canoe. Billy begged Uncle Al to send someone to find the two boys. He was trembling all over by then, shaking from exhaustion and cold and something harder to name. But Uncle Al was not looking at him. He was glaring at Larry, scratching the back of his head, and what came out of his mouth next made Billy's stomach drop. "What about my canoe?" Uncle Al demanded. That was his best canoe. How was he supposed to replace it? The camp director stormed off toward the lodge, muttering that they would have to go look for the canoe tomorrow. Billy stood there and felt the anger rise up through him like a flood. Uncle Al did not care about Tommy or Chris. He did not care that Billy had nearly drowned. He did not care that Larry had nearly died. He did not care about the counselor and campers who had vanished on a hike, or the creatures that had attacked boys in the woods, or the names that had simply stopped being spoken around camp. He cared about a canoe. Billy turned toward the cabin, cold and trembling, the anger curling slowly into something darker, because somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fury, a quiet and terrible thought was taking shape. The scariest part of his summer, though he had no way of knowing it yet, was still to come. Billy was all alone in the bunk that night. He pulled an extra blanket onto his bed and curled into a tight ball beneath the covers, wondering if his frightened, angry thoughts would keep him tossing and turning again. But he was so weary and exhausted that even the eerie, mournful howls from the forbidden bunk couldn't keep him awake. He fell into deep blackness and didn't wake up until someone was shaking his shoulders. Startled alert, he sat straight up. "Larry," he cried, his voice still clogged with sleep, across the room. Larry's bed was rumpled, the blanket balled up at the end. He had obviously come in late and slept in the bunk. But Tommy's and Chris's beds were still untouched from the day before. "Special hike," Larry said, walking over to his bunk. "Hurry, get dressed." Billy squinted and stretched and yawned. Outside the window it was still gray. The sun hadn't risen. "What kind of hike?" he asked. "Uncle Al called a special hike," Larry replied, his back to Billy as he grabbed the sheet and started to make his bed. With a groan, Billy lowered himself to the cold cabin floor. "Don't we get to rest?" he asked. "After what happened yesterday?" He glanced once more at Tommy's and Chris's unused beds. "It wasn't scheduled," he said darkly. "Where is Uncle Al taking us?" Larry didn't reply. "Where?" Billy repeated shrilly. Larry pretended he hadn't heard. "Tommy and Chris, They didn't come back. Billy asked glumly, pulling on his sneakers. They'll turn up, Larry replied finally, but he didn't sound as if he meant it. Billy finished getting dressed and ran up the hill to get breakfast. It was a warm, grey morning. It must have rained during the night, because the tall grass glistened wetly. Yawning and blinking against the harsh grey light, campers headed quietly up the hill, most of them wearing the same confused expression Billy had. Why were they going on this unscheduled hike so early in the morning? How long was it going to be? Where were they going? Billy hoped that Uncle or one of the counselors would explain everything at breakfast, but none of them appeared in the mess hall. The campers ate quietly without the usual joking around. Billy found himself thinking about the terrifying canoe trip from the day before. He could almost taste the brackish water again. He saw Larry coming toward him, face down, floating on the churning water like a clump of seaweed. He pictured himself trying to get to Larry, struggling to swim, struggling to go against the current, to keep afloat in the swirls of white water, and he saw a blur of the canoe as the strong river current carried it out of sight. Suddenly Dawn and Dory burst into his thoughts. He wondered if they were okay. He wondered if they were going to try to meet him again by the waterfront. Breakfast was French toast with syrup, usually his favorite, but this morning he just poked at it with his fork. Line up outside, a counselor cried from the doorway. Chairs scraped loudly. Everyone obediently climbed to their feet and began making their way outside. The sky had brightened to pink, but the sun still hadn't risen over the horizon. The campers formed a single line along the side wall of the lodge, near the bottom of the hill. Some kids were cracking jokes and playfully shoving each other, but most were standing quietly or leaning against the wall, waiting to see what was going to happen. Once the line was formed, a counselor walked the length of it, pointing his finger and moving his lips as he counted them. He counted twice to make sure he had the right number. Then Uncle appeared at the front of the line. He wore a brown and green camouflage outfit, the kind soldiers wear, and he had on very black sunglasses, even though the sun wasn't up yet. He didn't say a word. He signaled to Larry and another counselor, who were both carrying very large, heavy-looking brown bags over their shoulders. Then Uncle Al strode quickly down the hill, his eyes hidden behind the dark glasses, his features set in a tight frown. He stopped in front of the last camper. This way, he announced loudly, pointing toward the waterfront. Those were his only words, this way, and they began to follow, walking at a pretty fast clip. Their sneakers slid against the wet grass. To his surprise, Billy realized he was now nearly at the front of the line, close enough to call out to Uncle Al. So he did. "Where are we going?" he shouted. Uncle Al quickened his pace and didn't reply. "Uncle Al, is this a long hike?" Billy called. Uncle Al pretended he hadn't heard. Billy decided to give up. Uncle Al led them toward the waterfront, then turned right, toward thick clumps of trees a short way up ahead where the river narrowed. Glancing back, Billy saw Larry and the other counselor, bags still on their shoulders, hurrying to catch up, and as he stared at those low, tangled trees up ahead, a thought pushed its way into his head. He could escape. The thought was so frightening, but suddenly so real that it took a long time to form. He could escape into those trees. He could run away from Uncle Al and this frightening camp. The idea was so exciting he nearly stumbled over his own feet, bumping into the big kid ahead of him named Tyler, who turned and glared. "Whoa!" Billy told himself, feeling his heart start to pound. Think about this. Think carefully. He kept his eyes locked on the woods. As they drew closer, he could see that the thick trees, so close together their branches were all intertwined, seemed to stretch on forever. They'd never find him in there. It would be really easy to hide in those woods. But then what? He couldn't stay in the woods forever. Then what? He forced himself to concentrate, forced himself to think clearly. He could follow the river, stay on the shore and follow the river. It was bound to come to a town eventually. He'd walk to the first town. Then he'd call his parents. "I can do it," he thought, so excited he could barely stay in line. "I just have to run, make a dash for it. When no one is looking, into the woods, deep into the woods, and then leave Camp Nightmare behind forever. They were at the edge of the trees now, standing in the cool shadows. Billy spotted a narrow path into the woods a few yards up ahead. He tried to calculate how long it would take him to reach it. Probably 10 seconds at most, and then in another 5 seconds he could be into the protection of the trees. He took a deep breath. He braced himself. He tensed his leg muscles, preparing to run. Then he glanced to the front of the line. To his horror, Uncle Al was staring directly at him, and he held a rifle in his hands. The moment the narrator's eyes landed on the rifle in Uncle Al's hands, his blood ran cold. Had the man somehow read his thoughts? Just moments before, the boy had been silently measuring his chances of bolting into the trees and making a run for it. Now, standing there with a chill crawling down his spine, he could only stare, but Uncle Al wasn't looking at him. The man's sharp eyes were fixed on the two counselors, Larry and another, who had set down their heavy bags and were crouching over them, working at the zippers. The group of campers stirred with confusion. Tyler, the boy just ahead of the narrator, wanted to know why they had stopped. Another kid joked that maybe the hike was over. A few laughed. The mood was light, almost giddy. That mood did not last long. Without a word of warning, Larry and the other counselor began pulling rifles out of those bags, one after another, laying them out in a row. The laughter died. Every boy in the line went still. "Line up and get one," Uncle Al commanded, tapping his own rifle handle against the ground. One rifle per boy. He told them to hurry, but nobody moved. They all seemed to be waiting for the punchline, for some signal that this was an elaborate joke. There was no punchline. Uncle Al's patience snapped. He snatched up an armful of rifles and stormed down the line, shoving one into each boy's chest. When he reached the narrator, he pushed the weapon against him so hard, the boy staggered backward, barely catching the rifle by its barrel before it could clatter to the ground. He held it with trembling hands, staring at it with pure horror. He had never held a real gun before. His parents were fiercely opposed to firearms of any kind. Tyler leaned over and asked what was going on. The narrator could only shrug, his stomach knotting tighter by the second. A few minutes later, all the boys stood in a long row under the shadow of the trees, each one holding a rifle. Uncle Al waved them into a tight circle around him. Someone asked if this was target practice. Larry and the other counselor snickered. Uncle Al's face stayed hard as stone. He told them to listen up. "No more jokes," he said. This was serious business. The circle drew closer. The camp fell silent, except for a bird squawking loudly somewhere above them in the branches. That sound, oddly enough, sent the narrator's thoughts racing back to his plan to escape. He wondered, with a sinking feeling, whether he was about to be very sorry he hadn't taken that chance when he had it. Then Uncle Al delivered his news. 2 girls had escaped from the girls' camp the night before, a blonde and a redhead. The narrator's heart leapt straight into his throat. Dawn and Dory. It had to be them. The same 2 girls who had crept over to the boys' camp and hidden near the waterfront just days ago. He was almost certain of it. A wide, uncontrollable smile broke across his face before he could stop it. They had made it out. They had actually escaped. He forced the smile away fast, terrified that Uncle Al might see the joy written all over him. But then Uncle Al raised his rifle and finished his instructions, and every trace of that joy turned to ice. "The girls were in these woods," he said. "They were nearby. The guns were loaded." He told the boys to aim carefully when they spotted them. He told them the girls would not get away. The chapter ends there, suspended on that single, horrifying command, leaving one desperate question hanging in the cold air of the forest. Would those boys, guns loaded and Uncle Al watching, find Dawn and Dory before the girls could reach safety? Billy could not believe what he was hearing. Around the circle of campers, every face wore the same stunned, hollow expression. Uncle Al had just told them to raise their rifles and shoot. "Shoot them," Billy gasped. The words barely made sense. Uncle Al replied with a coldness that cut right through the summer air. "The girls were trying to escape," he said, "and the campers were supposed to stop them. But we cannot do that," Billy cried out. "We cannot shoot people." Uncle Al lifted his own rifle to his shoulder and mimed pulling the trigger, as if he were demonstrating something perfectly reasonable. "Easy," he said, "nothing to it." But when Billy pushed back harder, insisting they could not kill anyone, Uncle Al allowed himself a thin, unsettling smile. "Kill," he said, as though the word amused him. He never said anything about killing. The guns were loaded with tranquilizer darts. They just wanted to stop the girls, not hurt them. Then Uncle Al closed the distance between them. 2 slow, deliberate steps, and suddenly his face was hovering right above Billy's, the rifle still in his hands, his whole body radiating a dark, threatening energy. He asked Billy, in a voice like gravel, if he had a problem with that. It was not really a question, it was a dare. The other boys drifted back without a word. The woods went completely silent. Even the bird that had been squawking somewhere in the trees fell still. Uncle Al asked again, his sour breath washing over Billy's face, whether he had a problem, and something shifted inside Billy. He was terrified, yes. His legs felt like they might give out beneath him. But in that terror, something else rose up, something fierce and certain. He took one breath, held it, and then shouted with everything he had that he would not do it. Before he had fully thought it through, his rifle was up, its barrel aimed directly at Uncle Al's chest. The man's expression darkened into something uglier. He ripped his dark sunglasses from his face and flung them into the woods. His eyes narrowed to burning slits. He told Billy to drop the rifle, told him in that low, controlled growl that he was going to be sorry. But Billy did not drop it. He stood his ground and told Uncle Al that camp was over, that he was not going to do anything. His legs were shaking so badly he could barely stay upright, but he did not move. Uncle Al stretched out one hand and ordered Billy to give him the rifle. "Hand it over, boy," he said. Then said it again. Billy refused both times, loudly and without hesitation. Uncle Al's eyes narrowed further. He blinked once. He blinked twice. Then he lunged. Billy stumbled back a step, the rifle still raised, still aimed at the man charging toward him, and he pulled the trigger. The chapter ends right there, leaving one terrible question hanging in the air like smoke. Did the dart find its mark? And what happens to Billy now? The rifle was still raised, still aimed at Uncle Al's chest, when everything Billy thought he knew came crashing down around him. The rifle emitted a soft pop, and then Uncle Al did something Billy never could have predicted. He tossed his head back and laughed. He let his rifle fall to the ground at his feet without a care in the world. "Congratulations, Billy," he said, grinning warmly, stepping forward with his hand outstretched. "You passed." Billy stood frozen, confused, the rifle slowly lowering as his mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Around him, the other campers were dropping their rifles too. Every single one of them was grinning. Larry flashed him a thumbs up. Billy demanded to know what was going on, but instead of answering, Uncle Al turned toward the trees and called out that it was over, that Billy had passed, and that everyone should come out. And then they came. Dawn and Dory emerged from the woods, laughing and calling out congratulations. Billy cried out when he saw them, astonished that they had been hiding there all along. And then more faces appeared, familiar faces he had feared he would never see again. Mike stepped out from the trees, alive and well. Jay and Roger followed, Colin, Tommy, and Chris, all smiling, all perfectly fine. Billy felt dizzy. His mind could not hold it all together. Then his mother and father stepped out from the trees. His mum rushed forward and pulled him into a hug. His dad patted the top of his head and told him he knew Billy would pass, and Billy could see the happy tears shining in his father's eyes. It was too much. Billy gently pushed his mother back and demanded, with everything he had, to know what was going on. Uncle Al guided him away from the group. his arm around Billy's shoulders, his face bright pink with warmth. And finally the truth came out. This was not really a summer camp at all. It was a government testing lab. Billy's parents, both scientists, were preparing to leave on a very important expedition, and this time they wanted to take him along. But, according to government rules, no child could join an official expedition without first passing a series of tests. Every challenge Billy had faced, every terrifying moment, every impossible choice had been exactly that, a test. The forbidden bunk had tested whether he could follow orders. Rescuing Larry had tested his bravery. Refusing to hunt for Dawn and Dory had tested whether he knew when not to follow orders. He had passed them all, and everyone around him, every camper, every counselor, had been an actor working at the lab all along. Billy looked at his parents and asked the only question that still mattered. Where were they taking him? His father glanced at his mother, then answered with a small smile. A very strange planet called Earth, very far from where they were. The inhabitants were weird and unpredictable, and no one had ever truly studied them. It could be exciting, it could be dangerous. Laughing, Billy stepped between his mom and dad and wrapped his arms around them both. Earth sounded pretty weird, he admitted, but he was certain it could never be as dangerous or as exciting as Camp Night Moon. His mother smiled quietly and said only 2 words, "We will see."